His name was Hugh Thompson. He was 24 years old. He was sitting in the cockpit of a small observation helicopter, an OH-23 Raven, barely bigger than a car with rotors bolted on, and he was flying low over a Vietnamese village on a warm Saturday morning in 1968. His job was simple: scout the area, mark wounded soldiers for medics, report enemy positions, stay out of the way. What he saw instead was bodies. Not soldiers, not enemy combatants. Women, children, old men, scattered across the ground like they had simply fallen where they stood. Hugh Thompson looked down at those bodies, and something inside him went cold. Then it caught fire, because he understood, slowly, then all at once, exactly what was happening in that village on that morning. And he understood that if he did nothing, more people were going to die in the next few minutes. He had to choose. What Hugh Thompson chose that morning was something the United States Army had never trained him for. Something no field manual has a page for. Something that would destroy pieces of his life for the next 30 years, cost him his peace of mind, and nearly cost him his reputation entirely. He chose to stop it, and the country he served made him pay for that choice for 3 decades. This is the story of a man who followed his conscience instead of his orders, and what that conscience cost him. It's a story about the gap between what we ask soldiers to do and what we ask them to be. And it's a story that most people, even people who know about the event at the center of it, have never fully heard. Stay with me. To understand what Hugh Thompson saw on the morning of March 16, 1968, you have to understand what the previous year had done to the men on the ground. It had been a year of invisible death. Quang Nai Province, in the northern part of South Vietnam, was not a place where you fought a war the way war was supposed to work. There were no front lines. There were no uniforms to look for. There were no open battles with a clear beginning and a clear end. What there was every day, every week, for months on end, was the slow accumulation of men who stepped on things buried in the ground. Booby traps, punji stake pits, sharpened bamboo driven into the earth, covered with leaves, waiting for weight. Mines laid in rice paddies under 6 inches of water. Tripwires strung across jungle paths in the dark, at shin height, invisible until it was too late. You couldn't see your enemy. You couldn't engage him. You could only walk forward, one step at a time, and hope that today was not the day. Charlie Company, 1st Battalion, 20th Infantry, had been in country for months. They had already lost men, not in firefights, not in the kind of engagements that come with a clear narrative, but in sudden violent removals. One man walking 5 feet ahead of another, then gone, and the man behind him standing there covered in something, trying to understand what had just happened. By late 1967, Charlie Company's casualty rate for mines and booby traps was among the highest in the division. By early 1968, something had curdled inside the unit. The soldiers had begun to see the Vietnamese civilian population as participants in their dying. Every farmer working a field could be an informant. Every child playing near a road could be watching which paths were used. Every old woman who averted her eyes when soldiers walked by could have buried the mine they were about to step on. This was not rational, but it was the predictable psychological outcome of months of guerrilla warfare, where the line between civilian and combatant exists on paper, but dissolves completely on the ground. And then, in early March 1968, something specific happened that crystallized all of that hatred into something directed and dangerous. A popular sergeant named George Cox, a man the unit trusted, a man who held the unit together, stepped on a mine. He died immediately. His death broke something in Charlie Company, especially in the officer who commanded them. His name was Captain Ernest Medina. He was 33 years old. His men called him Mad Dog Medina, and they meant it as a compliment. On the night of March 15, 1968, Medina gathered his company for a briefing. The next morning, he told them they were going into a place called My Lai, a hamlet in the Mai village complex that American military maps had labeled Pinkville for the density of known communist activity. Intelligence said the 48th Viet Cong Local Force Battalion was using it as a base. Estimates put the enemy strength at between 400 and 500 fighters. The plan: enter the village at first light, engage and destroy the enemy, and leave nothing behind that could be used again. What Medina said next would be debated in courtrooms and congressional hearings for years. Some soldiers heard him say, "Kill everyone and burn everything. Kill the livestock. Poison the wells. Destroy the food supply. Level the village." Others heard something less explicit. Treat the area as a free fire zone. Assume anyone remaining is enemy. Still others remembered a specific phrase that left no real ambiguity. No one will be walking around in that area tomorrow morning. Medina later denied giving the order to kill civilians. But here is what every single soldier who marched into My Lai the following morning agreed upon, regardless of what exact words they remembered. They understood that no living person in that village was to be left behind. That night, the soldiers of Charlie Company cleaned their weapons and wrote letters home. Some were teenagers, 18, 19 years old, boys from farms in Kansas and Georgia who had barely been outside their home counties before the Army put them on a plane and told them this was where they were needed. And some of them, in the darkness of the firebase on the night of March 15th, 1968, made a decision about who they were willing to be when morning came. March 16th, 1968. A Saturday. The helicopters inserted Charlie Company at 7:30 in the morning. The soldiers hit the ground expecting a fight. They had been briefed that 400 enemy fighters were waiting. They had been told this would be a full engagement. Intense, dangerous, potentially the kind of contact that would define the unit. There was nothing, no return fire, no movement, no enemy presence at all. Just a village of farmers beginning their morning. Women cooking rice over small fires. Old men sitting in doorways. Children who had not yet been told enough about war to know they should run when helicopters landed nearby. And then someone started shooting. Who fired the first shot, and on whose specific order has never been definitively established. What the physical evidence and witness testimony together confirm is this. Within minutes of entering the village, soldiers of Charlie Company were killing unarmed people. An elderly man was bayoneted in front of his home. Women who ran from their doorways when the shooting started were cut down in the paths between houses. Families who had retreated inside were dragged out and shot in their own yards. A group of women and children who tried to run toward the rice paddies at the edge of the village were killed in the open. There was no firefight. There was no engagement. There were no enemy combatants. There was only a village and the men walking through it, and the decision that was unfolding minute by minute as the morning grew warmer. Then something happened no one outside that village would know about for more than a year. Lieutenant William Calley Jr., a 24-year-old officer from Miami, Florida, gathered what he estimated to be between 70 and 100 people. Women, old men, children, infants. He herded them to an irrigation ditch at the eastern edge of the village. He ordered his men to get into the ditch and fire. Some soldiers obeyed. Some refused. A few men stepped back. One soldier, Private Herbert Carter, is reported to have shot himself in the foot to be evacuated rather than comply. An Army photographer named Ron Heberl, who was embedded with the unit to document the operation, lowered his Army-issue camera. But enough men obeyed. The shooting lasted several minutes. 700 feet above all of this, Hugh Thompson was flying slow observation circles over the village. He was there to mark enemy positions, to watch for movement, to support the ground forces. Instead, he was watching something he couldn't initially make sense of. Bodies on the ground, scattered in the paths between homes. He assumed at first they were enemy casualties. But something was wrong. There was no sound of a firefight, no weapons fire echoing up from below, no visible engagement between opposing forces, just Americans moving through the village and Vietnamese on the ground, not moving. He flew lower. He looked closer. He started to count, and to look at what exactly was lying in those paths. What he saw were not soldiers. He could tell that clearly from the air. Women in traditional clothing. Children. A man too old to walk without a cane, crumpled beside a wall. Thompson set his helicopter down. He walked over to a sergeant he could see standing near a group of people who were wounded but still alive, lying in the dirt near a cluster of homes. He asked what had happened to these people. The sergeant told him not to worry about it. He said, "They'll all be dead soon enough anyway." Thompson climbed back into his helicopter. His hands were shaking. He had a green smoke grenade. The protocol was something he'd done dozens of times. Mark the location of wounded personnel with colored smoke, radio the coordinates, and a rescue helicopter would come. Simple. Standard. He did it now. He marked a group of wounded civilians, transmitted their position, and pulled up to altitude to watch for the medic team. Then something happened that Hugh Thompson would describe, 30 years later, as one of the worst moments of his life. He watched American soldiers walk toward the smoke and shoot the wounded. Hugh Thompson had just watched his own rescue marker, the signal he had placed to bring help, used as a targeting guide to kill people. Let that sit for a moment. He had marked those civilians for rescue, for medical attention. He had followed the protocol exactly as trained. And someone on the ground had seen that green smoke and thought, easier this way. Thompson flew in tight circles over the village, his jaw set, his mind running through everything he was seeing and finding no interpretation that made acceptable. Below him, the killing was still happening. Then he saw the bunker. On the southeastern edge of the village, a group of Vietnamese civilians had taken cover in a small earthen bunker. Women, children, 2 or 3 elderly people, huddled together and visible from the air. They were alive. He could also see a group of American soldiers moving toward them. He made a decision. He put his helicopter down, not near the soldiers, not near the bunker, between them, in the gap, in a physical space where any bullet fired at those civilians would have to pass through his aircraft first. He climbed out of the cockpit. He walked toward the American troops. And before he took a single step toward those men, he turned to his crew and gave an order that no training had prepared him to give. He told Lawrence Colburn, his door gunner, who was 18 years old, to aim the helicopter's M60 machine gun at the American soldiers. And if those soldiers fired on the civilians in the bunker, to open fire. Think about who Lawrence Colburn was in that moment. 18 years old, from Hamilton, Montana. He had enlisted in the Army at 17 with his parents' permission. He had been in Vietnam for less than 8 months. And his commanding officer, a man he trusted, a man whose judgment he had staked his life on for months, had just told him to be prepared to kill Americans. Not enemy soldiers. Not enemy combatants wearing the uniform of a hostile nation. Americans. Men who wore the same uniform he wore. Men who had gone through the same basic training, who had been shipped to the same country, who were on the same side. Colburn later said he did not hesitate. He said, "If they shoot those people, I'll do it." He said he was angry enough that it wasn't even a difficult decision. He was 18. Thompson walked up to the platoon leader, the senior officer on the ground near the bunker, and told him directly, "Hold your men. I'm evacuating the civilians in that bunker. If anyone fires on those people, my crew will respond." There was a long moment, a moment where the outcome of that morning, the lives in that bunker, Thompson's life, Colburn's life, whatever happened next, balanced on a single decision by a man on the ground. The officer stood down. Thompson walked to the bunker. He coaxed the civilians out, one at a time, speaking to them through gestures and whatever fragments of communication crossed the language barrier. He radioed for additional helicopters. He personally loaded 9 Vietnamese civilians, including several small children, onto the rescue aircraft that responded. He made 3 separate landings during the massacre that morning. 3 times he put his helicopter down. 3 times he placed himself and his crew between American soldiers and Vietnamese civilians. 3 times he filed radio complaints about what he was seeing. All 3 complaints were ignored before they left the area. Before Thompson's helicopter left My Lai that morning, one more thing happened. Something quieter than the rest of it. Something that belongs to one person and one moment and one choice made in the middle of an atrocity. While Thompson was loading the last of the bunker survivors onto the evacuation helicopter, his crew chief, Glenn Andreotta, walked toward the irrigation ditch, the one where the mass shooting had taken place. Andreotta was 20 years old. He was from California. He had no particular reason to walk toward that ditch except that he had seen what had gone into it and could not leave without knowing whether anything that had gone in was still alive. He climbed down. The ditch held somewhere between 70 and 80 bodies. The shooting had happened within the last hour. Andreotta moved through it slowly, carefully, and then he heard something. A sound, small and irregular. A sound that should not have been there. Buried under the dead, covered in blood that was not his, was a small boy. Alive. Andreotta pulled him out. He carried him to the helicopter. He held him on the flight out. That child's name was Du Hoa. He grew up. He went to school. He got married. He had children of his own. He was still alive when journalists found him in 1998, working as a cyclo driver in Ho Chi Minh City, trying to piece together the details of a morning from his earliest childhood that people kept telling him had changed everything. He was alive entirely because a 20-year-old crew chief from the United States Army had climbed into a ditch full of bodies and refused to accept that there was nothing left worth saving. Hugh Thompson landed back at Firebase Dottie and filed a formal report. He described what he had seen, what he had done, what had been happening in My Lai when he arrived, and what was still happening when he left. His report traveled up the chain of command and disappeared. The Army's official after-action report for the My Lai operation, filed on March 16, 1968, the same day, stated the following: 128 enemy killed in action, 0 civilian casualties. Mission success, no friendly casualties. Lieutenant William Calley was put in for a commendation for his performance that morning. The Army's internal investigation, ordered quietly and conducted quietly by the same chain of command that had issued the orders and received the after-action reports, found nothing of significance. Minor irregularities, procedural issues, nothing that warranted further action. Thompson's report was shelved. The reports of a handful of other soldiers who had tried to raise alarms were shelved alongside it. My Lai was buried, and Hugh Thompson went back to flying. He did what soldiers do. He kept doing his job. He flew his observation routes. He filed his reports. He kept putting one day in front of the next. But something had fractured inside him on the morning of March 16th, and it did not heal. Not then. Not for a very long time. He had done the right thing. He had risked his own life, placed his crew in danger, and directly confronted fellow soldiers in a war zone to protect unarmed people who had no one else willing to protect them. And the answer that came back from the institution he had served was clean and cold. We didn't see anything. You didn't see anything. Move on. My Lai stayed buried for just over a year. The truth came out because of a letter. In early 1969, a Vietnam veteran named Ron Ridenour sat down at a typewriter and wrote the same letter 30 times. He sent it to 30 members of Congress, the Secretary of Defense, the Secretary of the Army, and the Chairman of the Joint Chiefs. Ridenour had not been in My Lai, but he had been in the same region at the same time. And in the months after March 16, 1968, he had heard things from soldiers who had been there, men who couldn't sleep, men who needed to tell someone. He had collected fragments of a story that, when assembled, pointed towards something he couldn't stay quiet about. His letter said, "Something terrible happened in a place the soldiers called Pinkville. I don't know all of it, but I know enough to tell you that it needs to be investigated, and it hasn't been." Congress moved slowly. A young investigative journalist named Seymour Hersh moved much faster. Hersh tracked down soldiers who had been in My Lai. He interviewed them. He got them talking in the way that people who have carried something unbearable for a long time eventually need to talk. Quietly, carefully, but completely. He documented what had happened with a level of specificity and sourcing that made it impossible to dismiss as rumor. In November 1969, 20 months after the massacre, Hersh's story ran in newspapers across the United States. And then the photographs followed. The Army photographer embedded with Charlie Company that morning had carried 2 cameras, his standard Army-issue equipment, and his own personal camera. He had handed the Army's film over to his commanders, as required. His personal camera's roll of film he kept. His name was Ronald Heberl. His photographs showed what the official after-action report had called 0 civilian casualties. A group of women and children huddled together in a path between houses. Shot seconds later. Bodies in the ditch. A small girl with a wound in her chest. An old man on his back in a doorway, one hand still reaching toward something. Life magazine published them in December 1969. The world broke open. The Army's Peers Commission investigated thoroughly. Over 400 witnesses were interviewed. Evidence of a systematic cover-up, running from the ground level upward through multiple ranks of command, was documented in detail. 14 officers were charged with crimes related to the cover-up. All 14 had those charges dropped or dismissed. Of all the men present in My Lai on March 16, 1968, and there were well over 100, one man was convicted of a crime. Lieutenant William Calley Jr. On March 29, 1971, almost exactly 3 years after the massacre, Calley was convicted of the premeditated murder of 22 Vietnamese civilians and sentenced to life in prison with hard labor. He served approximately 3.5 years. President Richard Nixon intervened personally within days of the conviction, ordering Calley transferred from Fort Leavenworth to house arrest at his apartment on base. Nixon later commuted the sentence entirely. His stated reasoning was political and public. A large portion of the American population saw Calley not as a war criminal, but as a scapegoat, a young soldier who had followed orders in an impossible war and was now being sacrificed to make the Army look responsible. In the days following Calley's conviction, the White House received roughly 300,000 pieces of mail and telephone calls about the verdict. They ran 20-1 in favor of clemency. 20-1. Calley was released in 1974. He returned to Georgia. He managed a jewelry store in Columbus for many years. He occasionally gave speeches at veterans events. He died in April 2024 at the age of 80. And Hugh Thompson. What happened to the man who had tried to stop it? When Thompson's role in the events of March 16th became public knowledge, when it emerged through the investigations and hearings that he had been the one to file the original complaints, to confront American soldiers on the ground, to order his crew to open fire on their own countrymen if the killing continued, the response was not what you might hope for. Some people called him a hero. More people called him a traitor. Members of Congress stood on the floor of the House and called for Thompson to be investigated. Some demanded a court-martial, not for anything he had done on March 16th, but for the act of testifying against American soldiers in a public forum, for being willing to say, under oath in front of cameras, "Here is what I saw, and here's who did it." His mail contained death threats. Regularly. Not a handful. Regularly. He had to take precautions about his own safety in his own country. He found dead animals left at his home. Thompson came home from the army, married, divorced, married again. He struggled in the particular way that men who carry catastrophic moral weight without external support tend to struggle. Quietly, incrementally, over years, in ways that don't have clean beginnings or visible endings. He drank. He had nightmares about an irrigation ditch in Quang Nai province that recurred with the consistency of calendar. He rarely spoke about My Lai publicly. When he did, in the years before he received any recognition, he described the experience of trying to do the right thing and watching his country subsequently decide that the men who had carried out the massacre deserved more sympathy than the man who had tried to prevent it. For 30 years, Hugh Thompson received no official recognition for what he had done that morning. For 30 years, William Calley, the man convicted of ordering the murder of 22 civilians who served less than 4 years of a life sentence, was treated by significant portions of the American public as a victim. There are many dark layers in this story. That is among the darkest. Before we get to the end of this story, and there's an ending worth getting to, I want to stop for a moment. Hugh Thompson was not anti-war. He was not a protester. He was not a man who had joined the army reluctantly or who had philosophical objections to military service. He was a career soldier who believed in what he was doing and was good at it. He did not disobey a general principle. He disobeyed one specific situation on one specific morning because what was being asked of him, what was being silently expected of him by the institution that employed him, was to look away while children were murdered in a ditch. That's a finer distinction than it sounds. There's a version of this story that gets told as a story about individual heroism, one good man against a tide of evil. And Thompson was brave. What he did required extraordinary courage. I don't want to diminish that. But the harder truth, the one that doesn't fit neatly into the hero narrative, is this. The institution didn't fail once on March 16th. It failed continuously in the months of dehumanizing propaganda that preceded it, in the briefings that implied a massacre was acceptable, in the cover-up that followed, in the suppression of Thompson's reports, and most persistently of all, in the 30 years of official silence about what a 24-year-old warrant officer had tried to do. The institution failed to protect Thompson from the death threats and the mail and the dead animals on his doorstep. Because institutions protect themselves. And acknowledging that Thompson was right meant acknowledging what the army had done, what had been ordered, what had been covered up. One entire chain of command had agreed to pretend had not happened. It is always easier to make the witness the problem. And the reason this story matters, the reason I think it's worth spending 40 minutes of your day on a morning in Vietnam in 1968, is that the dynamic is not unique to this conflict, this country, or this century. Wherever there are institutions, there are people inside them who see something unforgivable and must decide what to do with what they've seen. The institution rarely says thank you. In 1998, 30 years after My Lai, the United States Army awarded Hugh Thompson, Lawrence Colburn, and Glenn Andreotta the Soldiers' Medal. The Soldiers' Medal is the Army's highest decoration for acts of valor performed outside of direct combat with an enemy force. Andreotta received his posthumously. He had been killed in action in Vietnam on April 6, 1968, 3 weeks after My Lai. He was 20 years old. He never knew whether the boy he had pulled from the ditch had survived. He never knew that what he had done that morning would be recognized, eventually, as one of the most significant individual acts of conscience in the entire history of the Vietnam War. He went back out on patrol, and he didn't come home. And for a long time, that was all anyone said about Glenn Andreotta. The awards ceremony was held in Washington. Thompson stood at a microphone and said words in public that had taken him 3 decades to be able to say. Some veterans in the audience walked out during his speech. Later that year, Thompson and Colburn returned to Vietnam. They went back to My Lai, back to the village, back to the paths between the paddies, back to the place where a helicopter had once landed between 2 sets of armed men and refused to move. The ditch where Calley had ordered the shooting is still there. It is preserved now, marked, part of the memorial complex that stands on the site. Visitors from around the world come to stand at its edge. Thompson stood there again for the first time since March 16, 1968. He met survivors, women who had been children in that bunker on that Saturday morning, people who had lost everyone they knew and had spent 30 years building lives over the absence. One woman held his hands and told him, "We thought all Americans wanted to kill us. And then you came." Thompson wept. He sat at the edge of the village where the ditch had been, and he wept. Not with relief, exactly. Not with simple grief. With something more complicated, the particular release that comes from carrying an impossible weight for 30 years and finally setting it down in the place where you first picked it up. Du Hoa was found by journalists in 1998 during the coverage of the 30th anniversary of My Lai. He was working as a cyclo driver in Ho Chi Minh City. He was in his early 30s. He knew he was a survivor of My Lai. He had been told this, but he carried almost no details about what had actually happened to him, who had pulled him from the ditch, who had been holding him when the helicopter lifted off, who had made the decision to climb down into that particular ditch on that particular morning. He was eventually put in contact with the family of Glenn Andreotta, the crew chief who had saved him, the man who had died 3 weeks later at 20 years old. Du Hoa stood in front of Andreotta's relatives and said, "I owe him everything. My children owe him everything. He is the reason any of us exist." I want you to follow that chain of consequences for a moment. A 20-year-old soldier heard a sound in a ditch that held 70 or 80 dead people. A sound he probably shouldn't have been able to hear. A sound small enough that any reasonable person, any person who had just spent the last hour watching an atrocity and was trying to process what they had seen, could have missed it. He climbed down anyway. And because he climbed down, a boy grew up. That boy had children. Those children have their own lives, their own futures, their own branches of consequence stretching forward through time from the single moment when a young man from California refused to accept that the worst had already happened. That is what one decision can hold inside it. That is what moral courage makes possible, even when, especially when, it costs everything. Hugh Thompson died on January 6, 2006, in Pineville, Louisiana. He was 62 years old. Lawrence Colburn, the 18-year-old gunner who had trained a machine gun on his own countrymen to protect Vietnamese civilians, survived the war and remained Thompson's closest friend until the end of Thompson's life. Colburn died in December 2016. In the years after the 1998 ceremony, Thompson gave talks at military academies and universities and high schools. He tried, in his careful and understated way, to answer the question that every audience eventually arrived at. How did you know what to do? His answer, as recorded in interviews and transcripts from that period, was something like this. I didn't know what to do. I knew what I cannot do. I cannot watch children be murdered and do nothing. I could not fly away and land somewhere else and file a report and go to dinner and live with myself afterward. That wasn't a calculation. It wasn't a decision I reasoned through. It was just, I cannot be the person who lets this happen, whatever that ends up meaning. I think that is among the most honest definitions of moral courage I have ever encountered in any story from any war. Not fearlessness, not philosophical certainty, not the confident knowledge that history will eventually vindicate you, because Hugh Thompson had every reason to believe it wouldn't, and he chose what he chose anyway. I cannot be the person who looks away from this. Whatever the cost. For Hugh Thompson, the cost was 3 decades of his country calling him a liar, a troublemaker, a traitor to the men he served alongside. For Glenn Andreotta, the cost was everything. He died 3 weeks later with no way of knowing that the boy he'd pulled from a ditch would grow up and have children who would grow up and remember him. For Lawrence Colburn, the cost was a lifetime of carrying the memory of being 18 years old and pointing a weapon at his own army, and knowing every day since that he was right to do it. In the village of My Lai today, there is a memorial, a museum, paths between the places where houses once stood, the ditch preserved and marked, photographs on the walls, names. There's also a small exhibit about Hugh Thompson, about the helicopter that put itself between 2 groups of people on a Saturday morning in 1968 and refused to move. In 2014, a school in Louisiana was named after him. Not a military base, not a weapon system or a warship, an elementary school. I've thought about that a lot. A building full of children, named after a man who once sat in a cockpit over Vietnam, looked down, and made a decision about what kind of person he was willing to be. There are worse things to name a school after. If this story stayed with you, if some part of it hit harder than you expected, share it with someone. Leave a comment about which part of this history changed how you see something you thought you understood. And if there's a story you want me to cover, someone history forgot, a moment that changed everything, a darkness the textbooks skipped past, drop it below. I'll see you in the next one.